what shamans do, what shamanic work is, why is it? It's a very ancient form of connecting to those laws of nature that not are immediately experienced at the surface level of this, what is open to the sensory perceptions. So in other words, every society, every tribe, every society would have their shamans. So the term shaman should not be really exclusively associated with this part of the world or this culture only. It simply survived, the term itself survived in the cultures that are more associated with this. But if we truly understand what was the work of a shaman and what function they fulfilled, or what function they were performing there, then we will actually see that this must have been really the affairs of our ancestors, irrespective of what way of life they've lived. Because this we're speaking about pre-religious times. We're speaking about the most primal way of living, very often at the mercy of living in the immediate contact with nature. The civilizations were not evolved when we could completely safely gather ourselves in the erected buildings and have the methodology and technology to protect, warm up our dwellings, completely alter the gene of the food that we produce and so forth. So in other words, we're talking about times when living in accord with nature was paramount to simply being alive. Because not every climate allowed that possibility. Not every climate, not every civilization rose around Hindus river. Not every civilization was built around the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates, where climatic possibility was such that it allowed the dwellers a kind of, there was this almost a collaboration. It's easier way to coexist. You know, long, prolonged summers, not so-called winters, and the rivers feeding you all the time. Agriculture rose. But in other parts of the world, being acute and fully aware and connecting to that what is hidden was paramount to being alive, if you will. Again, noteworthy observation that this is still a reductionistic perspective. If you will, it's more like a scholarly perspective. But I'm sharing this with you and invite you simply to ponder on this from this more utilitarian understanding of the term of those who were to conduct or act as a conduit for the possibility of reconnecting to these dormant forces of nature. And this macrocosmos and microcosmos had to be always essentially, the balance between the macrocosmos and microcosmos needed to be maintained. Even if for terrible diseases not to erupt in the community, for maintaining the coherence in the infrastructure, which from the point of view of us modern people, may appear as utterly primitive. You see, the form of the governing form of how people govern themselves, how they tend to themselves. But now this picture is being replaced, or at least there is this questioning, a healthy degree of questioning rising. That is it possible that a tremendous emphasis on this more kind of mathematical approach, computation of understanding nature in terms of observing the phenomena outside of the observer, simply observing and computing it and being able to come up with sophisticated technology makes us more sophisticated or makes us lose touch with that what otherwise our ancestors had direct communion with more than us modern people. And it is the shamans who held the keys, if you will. They were the conduits. So shamans were simply beings whose consciousness was expanded beyond the confines of what it means to be a human being alone. So this is the term shaman, decoded. And in certain cultures, like the Native Americans and the Siberian shamans, their role remained unique, specific, precise as well. To reconnect with those impulses of creative intelligence, aka divinities, if you will, those aka, also known as, those hidden aspects, hidden energies. Whatever your preferences, if you wanna relate to these as divinities, this that often seen as and spoken of in terms of the feminine noun here, then this essentially contacts and direct communication with these forces allowed freeing of tremendous amount of energy, which otherwise is locked, which otherwise is, if you will, suppressed. And it is why, with the rise of this kind of, the postmodernism is characterized by a variety of spiritual approaches and teachings simply being offered into the market. If before everything was at the expense and at the mercy of how and whom you run into, could be just like this lucky conversation took place and you learn there is this teacher, you know. I'm not talking about there is this priest, whether this is a Vedic priest or Catholic priest. I'm not saying that India was in a better place than Europe. Anywhere when this was in the hands of the custodians doesn't mean that these custodians were enlightened beings. But what we speak about here is this possibility, what postmodern age affords, did not exist in the past. So one's spiritual journey would be much more confined to that chance encounter where one would be led, I don't know, in pursuit of the land of Shambhala, or, you know, would that travel to Tibet, or simply traveling down somewhere to south of France, you know, and finding that old witch, right, who goes by the witch, but she's an enlightened being. See? With the rise of all this, the work of the shamans became more known. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's mostly associated today among many people with the intake of consciousness-altering substances that shamans administer, ayahuasca and so forth. Ayahuasca ceremonies, which indeed is one of the methodologies that what shamans are meant to supervise. To give what? To give and to gain access again to these pathways of communications which some were broken down. Broken down. They no longer exist. They are essentially withered away, like the groups of muscles that you don't use, they go into the atrophy. In the same way, this utter interconnectedness to other aspects of life, to other aspects, has withered away. We became these autonomous beings, autonomous, independent beings who are here doing our best to command the laws of nature. It's not long ago, it happened during my lifetime, when I was growing up, when the talks of altering the weather, diverting rivers, changing climates, all this was like kind of a talk of town. Who was talking this? Those who were considered to be the most educated, in fact. It was not talks of some kind of like a bunch of people who simply came up with this idea. No, this was a legitimate part of conversation. You know, we'll build a dam here to create electricity, we'll divert that river to create the, you know, to raise the agriculture in the area where there's no otherwise possibility in terms of nature. There were grand projects during the Stalin in Russia to divert some of the greatest rivers in Siberia into Central Asia. Have you heard about this? Crazy ideas. Some of this still goes on. You know, all this, I'm not going to take you into the spree of all this, what's going on still in terms of the dispersing the clouds, you know, chemtrails and all the rest of it. Of course it's going on. There's a lot of attempts to maintain the balance in a different way. It's not maintaining the balance. It's again this autonomous being, I'm here, evolved individual, and there is nature. And this nature needs to be communicated somehow, commanded somehow, because what it is, we live still in that not fully outlived itself paradigm of Newtonian perspectives. I don't even know why they called Newtonian. Newton was a deeply spiritual being, an alchemist, a deeply spiritual being, Sir Isaac Newton. But somehow, because his input mostly known for his what? Theory of gravity, isn't it? Exactly. The apple falls on the head, and we've seen that picture. See? It's not the apple of knowledge falls on his head. It wasn't a kind of like a biblical take on that. It's not that the apple from the Garden of Eden. It's apple, whatever that was. Pink lady, I don't know. Falls on Newton's head, and the theory of gravity here. Boom. And that's all we know of, and that's somehow that label Newtonian physics, Newtonian perspective. What it gave rise to is viewing nature simply as the set of laws that govern universe, as the grand machine. In fact, it is here in this part of Europe, very close, in Switzerland, where these first machines were tried to be assembled. The famous Swiss watches were made with that in view, you see? So that one can perfectly create this mini replica of universe where everything is governed by these very precise laws. You see? This is very, very reductionistic perspective. And of course, it was blown to pieces by the generation of scientists who came later. It was blown to pieces already at the beginning of the 20th century. The theory of relativity and the quantum physics with Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, all the way to David Bohm, that history of the science develops how even at that stage of infancy, radically departing from the understanding of the world we live in, even then it was not up to satisfactory. It gave rise to further and further and further, pushing the frontiers, pushing the frontiers. So how does that relate to this shamanic feel and everything? We all are one field of awareness, one field of consciousness, as earthlings, as human beings. The term butterfly effect is applicable to us, completely applicable. So as human beings, this idea, this governing idea, this what could be called as the overall understanding of the universe, overall takes root somehow, begins to develop. Yes, of course, each culture has their unique little islands, little nucleus of what is being created in this particular given culture. Unique in India, unique in China, in Japan, and in this part of the world, in this part of Europe, in this corner of the universe. But overall, there is also unstoppable process of globalization. What do you think happens? What do you think happens when this fabric begins to break down? When less and less number of people are connected through their heart beats, or if you don't like this, through the field that the heart emits to these realms and dimensions of existence. Because even the most so-called primitive parts of the world, we only want to educate them in our standard Western way of education. It's the only way what is considered to be as progressive, scientific, and proper. We are done with all this so-called pagan, outlived, primitive, what have you, native.
Done.
And this perspective brings and introduces that kind of subtle sense of arrogance, that everything that somehow feels and seems to us as not on par with our understanding, this technologically advanced understanding, somehow is questionable. Questionable. Whether we're talking about herb, a blade of grass, or whether we talk about what is and how to educate children. This is very important. But though it can be easily diverted us to the field of sociological studies, I'd like to keep your attention still firmly connected to this question that was raised yesterday, and it's partially further respond to that. So what happens when in the collective field of awareness, these connections begin to break down? What happens is that these very energies, they become dormant, they go underground. Where do they go underground? They go underground in our own beings, in each and every one of us. These aspects, they go underground as what? They go underground as our collective psychoses, as depression, as all these illnesses we have no idea and never had before. Because that's the way of consciousness. It was always understood. You dive into the study of Ayurveda more than just on a basic level of introductory level. You're bound to come to that consciousness-based ecosystem. You see? There are many environmentalists today speak of the importance of the ecosystem, 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 ecosystem. You constantly hear that. I heard that word long time ago. But there is a consciousness-based ecosystem. It's not just where do I dispose my plastic bottle versus where I shop, which is important, of course. But more importantly, it's that ecosystem of our subtler connections. We're talking about another kind of ecosystem here. So when the connection and the balance is broken, it's bound to erupt. Just as it happened in India, when India was severed from its connection, thousands and thousands years old connection to the practices, because it was not a Vatican kind of country, you see? India is very diverse in terms of its spiritual approaches and applications. Very diverse, very tolerant. So when the British Raj came, and when they analyzed that, they found that these people are unconquerable on their account, that the power of their connection to that source, what they consider source, is unconquerable. You cannot conquer this country. But, as that Lord reported to the Queen at the time, that, however, there is one way to conquer and rule this country. It's precisely by divide and rule. So we'll break them down, first of all, from the most immediate connection to where each village lives by. So in other words, you break down the connection from, let's say, their household-based Ayurvedic application in this country. Declare it to be a kind of on par with anachronistic and not so safe practices of voodoo. Make it, demonize it, makes it sort of like, and very quickly India was entirely severed, cut off from this very, very deep connection to these ancient practices. And what happened? In the following 100 years, India entered the period of the worst famines. The fact that we have this idea of India, right, of the colonial time and the first years, right, of the years, like India constantly, you go to India, it's like, this is changing now. It's a very different country. But some of you remember still when going to India was not even considered to be safe. It's like a germ bug. You go there to catch some disease. You can constantly, this is like all is happening there. But that was not always the case. The terms of sanitation were differently understood and differently applied. The whole rich culture, down to the folk vernacular, was so versed into that precisely what is called consciously based ecosystem, that people perfectly coexisted there. And that was broken down. When that was broken down, unknown diseases appeared, where even those who secretly practiced their craft and art were often left without proper ways of how to treat diseases because they simply did not know what these diseases were. And this disease is not just in terms of like a stomach bug. This is also what above all else affects our psyche. So taking this full detour in India was just an example. But what happens in our culture is that we became these autonomous beings. And the price we're paying is precisely that, a breaking down of this inner connection to the divine aspects, to these impulses of creative intelligence, which connects us to the rest of creation. As simple as that. They go underground and they go dormant. And they erupt in the form of what otherwise known as the, sometimes the most uncertain time to live in history in terms of, what the human psyche represents here. And I don't comply and buy this perspective that that's the story with human race, that we've always been like that. Don't listen to that. This is not true. Our nature is goodness. The nature of the human being is the nature of the divine being. This is the core value of who we are. That is the true meaning of the Adam. That is the true meaning that in the image of God and to take care of the paradise. It's the meaning of being a balance here. The balance, human being is that aspect which is capable of tipping the scales. You see? Tipping the scales. And the responsibility of human being, because of its unbelievably evolved nervous system, is to be able to maintain that balance. You see? So now, the shamanic aspect of this work also contains precisely that. We are directly connecting to these dormant forces, repressed, if you will, energies that rush to the surface to express themselves. And this is why often it sounds as a human zoo, because this is not at all what we think of. When we think and speak of divine energies, we often have this idea and ideal of Virgin Mary. You see? A Virgin Mary. We have this idea and ideal of this saintly-like form. But we forget that that is only one aspect, one-off aspect of this otherwise very multi-diverse energies. And in some cultures, that knowledge was preserved. In Tantra, it's the stuff of legend. Therefore, in parts of the world where this is still practiced, understood, and maintained, or rather, where it is understood and practiced, that balance is still somehow maintained. Because all these aspects, they are archetypal, foundational qualities beneath our apparent individualities, beneath our apparent personalities. So that we just understand what we're talking about here in terms of what is happening, why this shamanic feel to it. You see? Yes, it is. From that point of view, this work has undoubtedly these shamanic qualities.